The summer of 1949 witnessed an aviation first. On the 7th of July, the sleek, new de Havilland Comet airliner was wheeled out of its hangar to meet the press. It was the world's first jet airliner, a triumph of British technology capable of carrying 36 passengers over a range of 1,700 miles at a cruising speed of 500 miles per hour. The American aircraft giants had been beaten to the punch. At a time when Britain's Labour government was urging industry to export or die, it seemed as if its plane makers had come up with a world beater. The Comet was going to be the saviour of Britain's post-war aviation industry. Instead, it came close to destroying it. Britain's bright new airliner was a death trap. The result was a series of baffling crashes, which led to one of the most painstaking investigations in aviation history. The wreckage of a crashed Comet was pulled from the seabed and painstakingly pieced together. In a classic piece of air detection, the mystery of the crashing comets was finally solved. Jet aircraft were on the drawing board in 1939, but it was not until the closing months of the Second World War that they went into action. Germany had developed a number of jet-powered warplanes, of which the Messerschmitt 262 fighter bomber was the most successful. As a fighter, it struck terror into the hearts of American bomber crews as it ripped through their formations, firing rockets and cannon. But it arrived too late, and in insufficient numbers to change the course of the war. The same fate befell the Arado Blitz bomber, of which only 200 were built. These aircraft could not save Nazi Germany, but they pointed the way to the future. The British were not far behind the Germans. As early as 1937, Frank Whittle, a Royal Air Force officer, was testing a turbojet engine. Four years later, Whittle watched the maiden flight of the jet-powered Gloucester prototype, the E-28-39. The trim little aircraft was a test bed for a new fighter, the Gloucester Meteor, which entered service with the RAF in June 1944. The Meteor arrived just in time to combat the menace of Hitler's V-1 flying bombs, launched against southern England. The Meteor had the speed to pursue the V-1s and to shoot them down. With the onset of peace, the Americans looked set to conquer the air routes with passenger aircraft like the Lockheed Constellation. In 1946, they helped to carry more than 13 million passengers on scheduled flights run by 14 domestic American airlines. In the spring of 1949, Pan American stole a march on its great rival TWA with the introduction of the giant double-decked Stratocruiser, a development of the wartime B-29 bomber, which could accommodate up to 100 passengers in its main cabin. The Stratocruiser could also be fitted with 28 sleeping berths, as well as private compartments and 2 changing rooms. On its lower deck, passengers could relax in a cocktail bar. The British struggled to keep up, with aircraft such as the Avro Tudor, a descendant of the Lancaster bomber. The Tudor had a checkered career in the post-war years, culminating in what was then the world's worst air crash in March 1950, in which 75 passengers and 5 crew were killed. The future lay with jets. In the quest for supersonic flight, the de Havilland Company built the experimental DH-108. It eventually broke the sound barrier in September 1948, but not before it had killed 2 pilots, one of them the son of its designer. The DH-108 was the brainchild of Sir Geoffrey de Havilland, seen here on the right, under the nose of another of his aircraft, the elegant all-wooden Mosquito fighter bomber of the Second World War. De Havilland's company, based in Hatfield, now had its eyes on a bigger prize, a jet airliner capable of cutting the time of the London-New York run by up to 7 hours, or flying from London to Sydney in 4 hops and 36 hours. In conditions of great secrecy, work went ahead on the design of the DH-106 Comet. The Comet was years ahead of its time. It was designed to fly faster and higher than any other airliner of the day, wresting the initiative back from the dominant manufacturers in the United States. It was a formidable technical challenge. The Comet was powered by 4 de Havilland Ghost 50 turbojet engines, housed in pairs at the roots of its wings. Because the engines were jets, with greater thrust than piston engines, the Comet needed to carry a heavy fuel load, 6,000 gallons in all. This made strength and lightness all important in the design of the airliner. De Havilland's chief test pilot, the former night fighter ace John Cat's Eyes Cunningham, kept a close eye on de Havilland's handiwork. The Comet's specifications required the airliner to cruise at an altitude of 5 miles. Its cabin would have to withstand greater pressurization strains than any other plane. Its fuselage would have to be extremely strong. To solve what was essentially a metallurgical problem, the Comet was built with a new aluminium alloy, the thickness of which was no greater than a postcard. It was fixed to the airframe not by rivets, but with a special glue. The combination was very light, but the upholstery and the thin metal skin was all that separated the passengers from the air outside. By the time the Comet was rolled out for its first official flight, one of Britain's 2 nationalised airlines, BOAC, had ordered 14 of them at £450,000 each. As Cat's Eyes Cunningham eased the Comet off the runway to begin flight testing, it seemed as if a golden age of British aviation was about to dawn. The testing of the Comet proceeded smoothly at Hatfield. Cunningham and his technicians encountered few problems. If all went as planned, airlines wanting to use gas turbine-powered aeroplanes would have to look to Britain, in the short term at least. September 1949, and at the Farnborough Air Show, a critical audience gathered to watch the Comet reveal the shape of airliners to come. All eyes were on the revolutionary new aircraft as it took off. It then flew low over the crowds, providing a dramatic view of its swept-back wings. De Havilland was poised to sell air travel at a profit. Orders came pouring in. The program was launched to speed up the production line. Meanwhile, BOAC undertook an intensive program of route proving and crew training. Early in May 1952, the Comet was ready to begin regular flights to South Africa. It fell to Comet Yoke Peter to make the first scheduled passenger flight by a jet airliner when on the 3rd of May it took off from London for Johannesburg. Geoffrey de Havilland savoured a moment of triumph before takeoff. All went well for 6 months. The Comet's debut had overshadowed the launch of Pan Am's cheap transatlantic tourist-class Rainbow service, flown by the new propeller-driven 82-seat Douglas DC-6B. One by one, new routes were introduced to Singapore, Colombo, and Tokyo. To the critics who claimed that the 36-seat Comet was an uneconomic aircraft operated solely for reasons of national prestige, BOAC replied that its fleet was flying at a handsome profit. Other airlines agreed. Within months of the first flight to Johannesburg, de Havilland's order books for the Comet Series 1A and 2 were looking extremely healthy. Aviation magazines were loud in their praise of the latest triumph of British technology. The French airline, UAT, was one of a number which bought Comets for its fleet. But a sign that something was amiss came in a series of disquieting accidents. The first occurred at Rome Airport. Comet Yoke Zebra, with 35 passengers on board and bound for Johannesburg, took off in heavy rain. As the Comet became airborne, the aircraft began to shudder violently. The pilot took a snap decision, eased the Comet down and skidded to a halt only yards from the end of the runway, with the undercarriage sheared clean away. Passengers and crew were shaken but unhurt. The incident was put down to pilot error, but 3 more minor accidents suggested that the Comet did not take off easily and was hard to land. In January 1953, another runway overshoot at Entebbe in Uganda killed an airport worker. Then real disaster struck. At dawn on the 3rd of March 1953, the Empress of Hawaii, a Comet of Canadian Pacific Airlines, crashed on takeoff at Karachi. On board were 6 Comet technicians and a crew of 5, opening up the route to Australia. No one survived. Calamity struck again on the 2nd of May. That day, Comet Yoke Victor took off from Calcutta en route to Singapore. 6 minutes into the flight, the pilot radioed that all was well. Seconds later, the Comet blew up, scattering wreckage over miles. Everyone on board was killed. A report published 5 months later tentatively suggested that metal fatigue in the wings might have caused the accident. BOAC and de Havilland were reluctant to accept this finding. The Comets went on flying. The Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret did their duty and demonstrated their faith in the Comet, but the new airliner was beginning to look decidedly accident-prone. So far, there had been 5 serious accidents, including the writing off of a French Comet after another runway overshoot at Dakar. The Royals were all smiles, but worse was to come. On the 10th of January 1954, Yoke Peter, the first of the Comets, took off from Rome bound for London. Flying out over the Mediterranean, Yoke Peter climbed to 36,000 feet. Then contact abruptly ceased. Far below, on the island of Elba, eyewitnesses heard a great roaring noise and saw flaming chunks of metal falling into the sea. Comet flights were immediately suspended. At first, sabotage was suspected. Civil unrest between the Greek and Turkish populations of the British Crown colony in Cyprus were boiling up to a bloody climax. The Greeks wanted union with Greece. The Turkish Cypriot community wanted independence. There was speculation that a bomb might have been placed on the Comet at Beirut. Sabotage was a convenient theory for de Havilland and BOAC, but it did not satisfy some experts who suspected that Yoke Peter had suffered a catastrophic loss of pressurization. A number of modifications were made to the Comet, and these were rigorously flight tested. But no one really knew what had happened to Yoke Peter, which lay 80 fathoms deep at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, de Havilland's chief test pilot remained confident.
We're working vigorously on them, and now that we do know what happened, it's really just up to us to get the work done, get these aircraft back into service as quickly as possible.
The public was reassured, and the Comet went back into service in March 1954. For a few weeks, all seemed well. Then, on the 8th of April, a Comet of South African Airways took off from Rome for Cairo. 7 minutes after takeoff, the captain radioed that he was climbing to 36,000 feet. Then silence descended. The Comet was never seen again. Once more, the Comet fleet was grounded. A note of desperation entered BOAC's handling of the crisis. The intrepid Cunningham recreated the prelude to the accident, which bore a chilling similarity to the loss of Yoke Peter. Both Comets had taken off from Rome, and both had lost radio contact over the sea at the zenith of their climb. An operation was already underway to find the wreckage of Yoke Peter, the more easily recoverable of the two Comets. The hunt was led by a Royal Navy anti-submarine frigate, sweeping 100 square miles of sea. Back at home, the British government belatedly withdrew the Comet's certificate of airworthiness. An investigation was ordered. No stone was to be left unturned. Money was no object. The Comet mystery had to be solved. The experts had predicted that the sea search for Yoke Peter would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. But the first contact was made after 11 days. Some passenger seats and luggage were brought to the surface. While the search continued, Italian forensic scientists examined the bodies recovered after Yoke Peter went into the sea. They found that the victims had all died from violent movement and explosive decompression. Most of them had fractured their skulls while still alive, but only a fraction of a second before they died. None had been burned, and all of them had died before they hit the water. Television cameras were lowered to the seabed to pinpoint sections of the wreckage of Yoke Peter. Bit by bit, the Comet was pulled from the sea. The nose section came up. Strapped into the co-pilot seat was the corpse of the engineer. No one knew why the two men had changed places. The rear spar, some 60 feet long, was recovered from its watery grave. Then the jet engines and undercarriage were brought up. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, the recovered Yoke Peter and 3 brand new Comets were subjected to an intensive series of tests by a team of experts under the direction of Sir Arnold Hall. It took 5 months and £2 million to come up with the answer. A prime suspect for the crashes was metal fatigue at the wing roots of the comet. By now, nearly all of Yoke Peter had been hauled up from the seabed. Every inch of the doomed airliner was examined for clues as to what had happened in the skies above Elba. A tank was built to accommodate the fuselage and wings of a Comet. The sacrificial victim arrived. Work went on around the clock. When all was ready, water was pumped into the tank. The pressure in the cabin was raised to simulate the effect of flying at 44,000 feet. Flexing the wings with hydraulic lifts enabled the investigators to reproduce 3 hours of flying in a matter of minutes. But the breakthrough came with the recovery of the top center section of Yoke Peter's fuselage. This contained 2 fiberglass windows which housed the navigator's direction-finding aerials. The pressure tests in the tank had produced cracks in the wings, and worse. The Comet's aluminium alloy skin had been ripped open like a sardine can. What had caused the fatal weakness? It was traced back to the fiberglass squares in the top section of Yoke Peter's fuselage. The rivets which held the windows to the Comet's skin had been placed too near the edge. Cracks were found to be running away from them. A new Comet in the pressure tank exploded in the same way. Now there could be no doubt. One badly riveted square foot explained the Comet mystery. Would the Comet ever fly again? All the painful lessons learned from the Comet 1 crashes were poured into the Comet 4, which was wheeled out in April 1958.
The Havillands will always be grateful to BOAC for the confidence which you showed in us by giving us a second chance to make the Comet work.
De Havilland were back in the race to become the first transatlantic jet carrier. But the Americans had caught up. Pan Am's Boeing 707 was poised to snatch the prize. So confident were Pan Am that they advertised their imminent victory. But they were beaten to the tape by the Comet 4. On the 4th of October 1958, 3 weeks before the first 707 crossing, 2 Comet 4s landed, one in New York from London, the other in London from New York. It was a gallant gesture, but the Comet had never been intended for transatlantic flights. It was quickly replaced on the Atlantic route by BOAC's 707s. Nevertheless, pride had been salvaged, and the Comet's commercial life on other routes lasted another 22 years.